Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, co-president of, former co-president of ColumbiaDC, currently board member and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, let me thank our partners, MIT Club of Washington, D.C., and their members for being with us this evening. We have a very exciting conversation on exploring links between California's fires and climate change. And we have gathered a very distinguished panel, Professor Steve Weissman, Dr. Danielle Touma, Alison Saldanha, and our host, Lily Jamali. Please allow me to briefly introduce them, but I encourage everyone to check our website for their full bio and full list of their great accomplishments. Steve Weissman created and directed the Energy Law program at Berkeley Law, where he also taught energy law and policy classes since 2006. Before that, he was an administrative law judge for California Public Utilities Commission, and he also served as policy and legal advisor to 3 different commissioners at the PUC. He's a former principal consultant to the California State Assembly's Committee on Natural Resources, where he wrote and reviewed legislation concerning energy, air quality, and solid waste management. He's vice chair of the American Bar Association's Publication Committee for the section of Environment, Energy, and Resources. Dr. Danielle Touma is a postdoctoral scholar in the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management at UC Santa Barbara and a visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. She investigates the impact of anthropogenic activities on trends in extreme rainfall, drought, fire risk, and post-fire hazards using observational data, climate models, and statistical tools. Alison Saldanha is a data reporter for the NPR's California Newsroom investigations team, where she recently led the team's data investigative feature on the impact of wildfires across the US. And she's also a graphic reporter for the Seattle Times. Until last month, she was part of the New York Times graphics department, where she worked as a data administrator for its Pulitzer Prize-winning COVID tracking project. And our host, Lily Jamali, is co-host of KQED's The California Report, which airs on NPR stations throughout the state. Before that, she was the anchor of Bloomberg Markets Canada, where she steered editorial coverage of her daily news program covering financial markets, economics, and politics. Lily holds an MBA in finance from NYU's Stern School of Business, a master's from Columbia University's School of Journalism, and a bachelor's degree in English from UCLA. So without further ado, it's all yours, Lily. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Kambiz. It's such an honor to be here, and I do want to begin by thanking the Columbia Club of DC as well as the MIT Club of DC for co-sponsoring this event. I've been looking forward to it for months, and I can't believe it's finally here. For the last half decade, Californians have confronted the new reality of fire seasons that start earlier and end later with each passing year. We know that climate change is a key driver of this very concerning trend. These longer fire seasons have grown deadlier and more destructive than ever. And while climate change can exacerbate conditions, it doesn't provide the spark. Many of the fires that have destroyed entire communities in California, and we should say throughout the West really, have been ignited by downed power lines belonging to major utilities, including Pacific Gas and Electric, which has sparked a series of catastrophic fires since 2015. These fires have changed the way we live in California. They've forced us to rethink where we live and how we can protect our communities and how to protect ourselves from unhealthy wildfire smoke. I'm really proud and honored to be a part of this conversation because the group we've assembled is just a wonderful group of journalists and researchers and people who understand regulation better than just about anybody. So I'm so pleased that Steve, Danielle, and Alison are able to join us tonight or this afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. I wanted to set the table for this conversation by putting the question out there, because this is such a unique opportunity to speak to a different audience. For the last 3 years, I've spoken to a California audience primarily, but this is such a great chance to speak with other parts of the country, including the East Coast, where so much of our federal policy is made. So the question is, what can the rest of the country learn from California and the West when it comes to how we became ground zero for these climate-driven fires, and what we can do to mitigate the impacts of that? So Steve, as our utility expert, thank you again for joining us. Why don't we start with you, and how do you think the rest of the country can learn lessons from us?
When you think about the ingredients that have gone into the problems California is facing right now, and in one form or another, these ingredients apply just about everywhere in the country. You've got the combination of course, climate change, which is shifting weather patterns and causing in many places more conditions that can lead to a hurricane or can lead to severe fire hazards. You also, in terms of the interface with the electric utilities, have had nationwide a movement away from the more traditional approach of regulating a utility company as a vertically integrated company that owns everything from generation down to the meter. And instead, they've been introducing various aspects of competition. So you have people building power plants wherever they want to. You have the problem of sprawl occurring in lots of places as well. So you wind up having to run lines out to areas that you didn't have to before. But so far, what we've seen is that these forces of competition do what they're supposed to do, which is to enable individual players in the markets to do things that are within their best and most enlightened interest. But that doesn't always add up together to things that are going to help everybody and meet the common good. We've seen this particular utility problem now crop up both in California and in Texas, but I think that the root causes of the problem are the same in both areas. And I could, go into more detail on that if you like.
And we're definitely going to ask you to do so.
Okay.
The next hour and a half. And I also want to invite our audience to, be asking us questions. You can participate in the Q&A. We're going to spend the first half of the next 90 minutes in conversation, and then we'll turn to your questions. So now is a great time to start populating that part of the Zoom. Danielle Touma, Dr. Touma, you spend a lot of time working on quantifying the impacts of climate change. Again, the question is, what is it that the rest of the country can learn from us here in California? You're doing your research from, really ground zero for a lot of these impacts. You are based in Santa Barbara, where you see perennial, you see fire season, but then you also see impacts that often don't get nearly as much news coverage. And that is the aftermath of these fires, the debris flows and the mudslides, which get maybe a day or two of coverage versus sometimes weeks and months on a particular fire. Why is quantifying climate change so important for somebody sitting in DC or in New York?
Yeah, so one thing I've been thinking about is how here in California, we are starting to see our projections that we had 20 years ago as climate scientists using climate models. We're starting to see our observations actually line up with those projections that we had 20 years ago. And I think that's something we really need to pay attention to in other parts of the world where we have projected changes, not only in temperatures, but also things like storms, snow, extreme snow, that kind of stuff, in other parts of the country and the world. So it's, I think there's a clear signal here in California that, what we thought would happen now is actually happening. And even though we don't have day-to-day predictions of the weather from that long ago, we are seeing kind of the bulk statistics of these types of extremes changing in a way we kind of projected to change in the future. So I think it's a clear signal and kind of a clear kind of picture and what we, were projecting, 20 years ago today. And so I think we as climate scientists are gaining more confidence in kind of understanding what would happen in the future in a grand, kind of in a big picture sense of things. And I think what's happening here in California is starting to show us that, yes, we know what's happening, and we need to start thinking about planning for the future based on what we know as climate scientists, what we know on how the climate might be changing due to our activities. So I think what's happening in California is kind of a, it's basically, that's kind of what I've been thinking when we discussed this question before. I think, so.
It's definitely a model for how to find the signal amidst the noise. And I really look forward to talking to you more about your research throughout the next few minutes, because that is really so core to what you do in your work. Alison, I wanted to invite you in. You recently came out with an extraordinary investigation that was jointly produced with KQED and NPR California Newsroom, looking at smoke impacts. And we in California have been talking about smoke really for about a half a decade now. I remember I moved from Canada to California in 2018. And when that major fire happened in November of 2018, I remember being shocked seeing people wearing what looked like, gas masks basically around Berkeley, California. I was just like, what planet have I landed on? And I had lived in Berkeley before moving to Canada. So it was just so jarring that this was the way Californians had learned to acclimate to this new environment in the 2 years that I had been away. And you've studied the impacts of smoke. It is far from limited to California. You ask anybody in Washington or New York or in the Midwest, they will probably have a story about the impacts of wildfire smoke from our fires here in the West. So I wonder, again, lessons for the rest of the country. What did you learn?
Yeah, so well, obviously, as everyone has sort of noticed, is that the wildfires have been burning hotter, faster, and stronger than ever before. And in a lot of ways, when we sort of started on this project, we realized that the science is still catching up to it, and we wanted to quantify what that exposure means, because by the time the research comes out, it may be a little too late for everybody to understand how dangerous this exposure can be for all of us. So we partnered with Stanford University's Environmental Change and Human Outcomes Lab. And what we got was smoke exposure for the last 10 years from satellite data mapped to the zip code. And then based on that data that they managed to extract from the geosatellites, we analyzed it to understand. We sort of made a time period that's like the before times, before the wildfires were so crazy. So that was our 2009 to 2013 period. And then we looked at the current period to see how exposure has changed. And what we found was really troubling, because it's not only just a Northern California problem or a Central Valley problem where the wildfires have been a particular you can sort of see the smoke being trapped in the air because of the landscape. You can see, in fact, that exposure across the country has grown, and we're looking at increases of 50% to 200% clear across the country, thousands of miles away. And when you look at the data, you can see that it's gotten particularly worse in this current period because California's wildfires are driving that change. And typically, when you think about wildfires, or when a regular person starts to think about it, they're looking at forest areas burning very far away from them, not anywhere near the urban areas. But that smoke is traveling great distances and is starting to enter your respiratory system, and it's going to affect, and researchers are starting to look at how all of this exposure is starting to impact us. And yeah, places like Boston and DC are looking at 50% more smoke exposure than they did less than a decade ago. And California is driving this change, which means that it's not just a West Coast problem anymore, it's a national problem.
I may be having some internet issues, so if that is the case, I'm going to just jump off and jump back on with a different computer. But folks, the administrators, if you would let me know if I'm not coming across clearly, do let me know and I'll make the switch. You know, I wonder from you, Danielle, we actually, you know, end up talking so much now about how climate change is real. It's not even really a debate anymore in media circles. That is the going, you know, baseline level of, I don't even want to call it an assumption, it's a fact. And I think we've come such a long way, even in just 5 to 10 years, operating from that place of truth. But what your work is so focused on is kind of teasing out the human impacts on climate change. What got you interested in that work?
Yeah, so for me, I was a civil engineer as an undergrad and a master's student. And at the time, I was interested in water resources, and I was just kind of a little disappointed in how little talk about climate change there was for such a strongly linked, you know, entity, water resources. Which relies on weather patterns and, you know, what we know about the climate. So that started to get me thinking about climate change impacts on hydrology. And then eventually, after some research experience, I decided I wanted to study climate change itself and to try to understand what is happening to the climate in a way is important that could be used by water resources, by planners. So that's what got me to extreme climate events like fire weather and droughts and extreme rainfall, because those are the kind of events that we really need to be planning for. In addition to kind of just mean changes in the climate. So that's what really got me into it. And I think, you know, so I started my PhD in 2012 on this, and so, or 2013. And so I found that even since I started until now, we've developed so much more understanding of how kind of our you know, how the mean climate relates to these extremes. So not only do we know that global temperatures are changing because of our human activities, but we also know that these type of extremes, like extreme fire weather, which are, you know, fire weather is days where you have low humidity combined with high temperatures, low precipitation, and high winds. We know that our human activities are now affecting these types of days. We're getting more of these days where fires are more likely to ignite and spread. And so I think it's pretty amazing, just within 10 years from when I started my PhD until now, we have started to be able to develop this understanding of how exactly we as humans are impacting things like fires, fire activity.
Yeah. Steve, I'd love it if you could weigh in on this as well, because you have been working within the utility regulation space, either, you know, really in the thick of it or teaching it to other people for a number of decades now. How has the conversation around climate change evolved since you started your career?
There was no conversation about climate change when I started my career with the state regulators, and that was actually certainly one of the problems. I noticed part of what attracted me to work first in energy regulation was the agencies involved in that were really focused on two things. One is just reliability, and the other is trying to keep costs down. And yet every day they were making decisions that were having an impact on social and environmental justice, on the distribution of wealth, but also on very many environmental factors, including the precursors for climate change. And yet they weren't talking about those things. It was just not part of the conversation at all. And if you looked at the mission of the organization, it just had to do with reliability and low cost. And so now you can see things have shifted. If you were to look at the official mission statement for the California regulators right now, you'd see definite understanding that they have a responsibility in these other areas that I'm mentioning. But coming into academia, which I did about 15 years ago, there was conversation at the time, for instance, about the potential for climate refugees, for the potential you're going to have people who are going to be moving as a matter of survival. And arguably, we're already in the thick of that. You could look at various places where there's a tremendous amount of migration occurring, and you could probably find some consistencies in terms of problems brought on by climate change. But what we weren't anticipating and what we're seeing now is a very different kind of climate refugee. These are people who might have every choice in the world as to where they're going to go and what they're going to do, and are choosing to make a decision based on things like, well, am I going to have to put up with 40 or 50 days of very unhealthy air where I'm living right now? It's not refugees born out of desperation. It's born out of privilege and choice. And so you're seeing a different way of looking at that particular issue now than we were seeing then. So what was part of the effect, though, of this ignoring the problems of climate change on the regulatory side? We'll just use one example, a particular transmission line project that I was involved with as an administrative law judge. This was a line that runs significantly across the U.S. side of the Mexican border through Southern California. And the concern was, well, if you co-locate that line with the one that already exists, then you run the problem of having a reliability problem. If an airplane was to hit one of the lines, it would hit two of the lines, and then suddenly you'd lose a huge amount of power. So the choice was made to take that second line and have it veer off to the north and have it avoid a lot of that existing right-of-way. And that meant going through forested land that never had those kinds of impacts before. Did anybody at the time ask, what is this going to mean in terms of the potential for having lines that are going to be sparking fires in forested areas? No one asked that question, not even the environmental groups that were involved. And so, of course, that conversation's flipped a lot now. You're seeing a very different perspective than we did before.
It is really remarkable to think about that being absent from the conversation, given what it is like to live in the West today. And Steve is doing the good work, as he has been for 15 years, of teaching this next generation of utility regulators and public utilities commissioners, I hope, how we got to this point and giving them the tools and the knowledge to do it right. So thank you for that. Alison, you are now in the West. You recently relocated from the Midwest to Seattle. And as part of your investigation, the thing that I thought was so striking as I was reading it was how, again, it wasn't just for a California audience. Very high in the story, you talk about the impacts on regions all across the country. And you had some very interesting indicators that you also brought into the story, such as, I think it was like albuterol prescriptions are in there, for example. I just thought that was such a fascinating way to quantify what the effects are that we're all seeing in our daily lives. And so, I wonder from you, how do you bring that kind of science to a mass audience to make it have impact, to make people drop what they're doing and read your story, whether they're in California or in Texas or in Minnesota, wherever they may be?
That's a really good question. And I think the answer is not easy, but it is that you have to try and keep it really simple. Because, this is something, and it's great that I had a great editor who could cut out all the jargon. Yes, shout out to Aaron Glantz. But essentially, I can sort of see how when you're in the weeds with the research and the data and you know, you're trying to communicate your findings and you're trying to draw attention to this really important problem, there's a chance that there is a tendency to get lost in the jargon with it. And so one of the most important things is to really, you know, pull yourself out of that, or get someone to help you pull out of that, to get out of that, and talk to someone as if you were, I don't know, if you were talking to your grandmother. That's usually what we say in journalism, is that you have to like figure out a way that you're talking to someone who has no idea about this, and how would you explain it to them? How would you break it down? And I think a few other things that help along the way is having visuals, because we're visual learners, where we respond as human beings better to visuals and audio than we do to text. And that, I think, is something that we've tried to incorporate with this, because we created an interactive map. So initially, you might think, what is this dangerous air all about? What are they talking about? They might not even decide to read the story. But if you like look at a few bullet points that come out as tweets, or if you look at the map, which shows that the whole US is on fire, essentially, that sort of draws your attention in. And then if you're allowed to interact with that data, if you're allowed to see how it affects you, not only nationally, but at a hyper local level, it sort of makes the problem more relatable. And you know, having all of this research, all of this data, all of these findings, it's great to have all this science to back you up, but then you need to pull yourself out of that and then try and make this about the humans that make up that are affected by that data, and you know, really add soul to those findings. So one of the most important things that we did for that is then to go and talk to people and see how it's affecting their day-to-day lives and how it's impacting them. And as part of that, we then looked at albuterol prescriptions, asthma medication. We looked at hospitalizations, and that was just born out of the idea that we need to make this super relatable to people living their everyday lives, and just try to show that the smoke is invisible, but it's impacting you. So, yeah.
Dr. Touma, and there's a couple questions coming in, so keep them coming, because around 4:15 Pacific, like 7:15 Eastern time, we're going to switch gears and turn it over to questions. But Dr. Touma, you know, are scientists doing a good enough job at communicating the research that is being, you know, I mean, there's some amazing research coming out of systems like the UC where you're based, but are they doing a good job getting it to the people who can do something with it?
That's a really good question. That's something as a scientist try to do myself. So when a paper comes out, we work with our media office at UC Santa Barbara to, you know, make the story relatable, as Alison was saying, to people locally and maybe even regionally. But it's definitely hard. It's definitely hard to pull yourself out of that data. I was nodding a lot to Alison when she was talking about kind of, you know, getting in there, seeing all the numbers, and it's hard to remember that, you know, not everybody sees this data every day. Doesn't really, you know, if there's nothing you can relate to, it's hard to really understand what's going on. I think we are getting better. I think there's a lot more we can do. As a climate scientist who works on more like large areas, so kind of looks at like all of the Western US as a region, all of Eastern North America as a region, you know, kind of looks more at global things. I'm trying to focus more on certain areas that are affected more, maybe, and try to have more stories out of that kind of in my research, have some case studies and that kind of stuff. But I think as a whole, I think scientists are getting better at communicating, especially people who work on things like fire, things that affect people in really big ways. And it's just like the researchers, I think the federal agencies are doing a really good job. NOAA has a really great database that's really easy to navigate with some really great visuals about droughts, fires, other extremes. I'm happy to share that link later if anyone's interested.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, and the National Climate Assessment has a really good website as well, and really easy to see figures and that kind of stuff. So I think we are better, but I think a lot of times we do get kind of caught in our data and our academic papers, and mostly I think one thing where we are getting better is talking to scientists, talking to people in utilities, people in like the UC has I think they call it a cooperative extension, and they're basically a science that work with planners, managers, local stakeholders to kind of communicate the science across and to try to make science more applicable to things on the ground. So, so I think
as a journalist, there does seem to be a moment happening for scientists, because of the pandemic, unfortunately, but we are seeing, I think, a moment where there is tremendous, obviously a lot of this is really, there are political lines to be drawn around what I'm about to say, but I do see a lot more doctors and medical professionals and such on cable news and, out in the mainstream media. And I've seen the same over the last, 3 to 4 years, probably, with fire science becoming a discipline that, we are always coming to folks like you and Daniel Swain at UCLA to get, the real deal of what is happening right at this moment. I mean, even just in the last day or two, the whole conversation around fire season has changed in California because we're getting precipitation in the middle of October, which is remarkable. And so having those, there's the long-term research, but there's also the okay, what's happening today, what's happening tomorrow, and getting those people on TV and on the radio in the news.
Yeah, and I think that's something that also I'll just add in, science has made possible. Recently, we've been able to see an extreme event and kind of attribute it to our long-term greenhouse gas emissions and aerosol emissions and all that. And I think that also makes it easier for people to say, wow, I just experienced this extreme event and it was a lot more likely now because of our emissions than it would have been 50 years ago. And I think that's something that's our advances in science has allowed us to do and has allowed us to relate to things that people are experiencing kind of more instantaneously. But yeah, and I'd like to add that Danielle Swain is one of my colleagues and also a mentor when it comes to science communication. So I'm glad to.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. A big fan of his. I wonder from you, because you spent much of your career at the California Public Utilities Commission, do the kinds of articles that Alison is writing and the kinds of important research that Dr. Touma and her colleagues are doing, does that stuff get in front of commissioners at a place like the CPUC? Are they getting this information? Are they looking at granular data, or are they operating at such a high level that it is not getting to the 5 people who happen to sit on that commission?
The important details are collected and do find their way into an evidentiary record that goes to the commissioners. If commissioners themselves don't tend to sit in on all of the hearings that are held, and they certainly don't sit down and read the extensive evidentiary records that are accumulated in various cases. At any particular time in California, there are about 500 different proceedings pending before the PUC. And so the closest that they can get usually is the individual decision makers will have advisors on their staff, so who might dig in a little bit into the details. But what tends to happen is you'll have the staff of the agency and someone like me as an administrative law judge who will look at all of the numbers and all the details and all the studies, and we'll try to come up with an approach to resolving the situation that best reflects that record. But then when it gets handed to the commissioners, it often is a very different story. Sometimes if people are struggling with the facts and difficult information, they'll take a step back and say, well, I've got to make this on a gut basis. I'm going to decide what feels right to me as a decision maker. And also, unfortunately or otherwise, depending on your perspective, these decision makers at these agencies tend to be very much affected by the politics that's surrounding them. The California Commission is defined as part of the state constitution, and it's supposed to be an independent agency, but the reality is that the governors who get to choose the people to put on the commission are often looking for people, first of all, that they would agree with, but second of all, that are going to be willing to listen to them. And there's a lot of communication going back and forth between the governor's office and the commissioners, between concerned legislators and the commissioners. And so all this gets put into the equation. And frankly, very much of the time, a lot of the important detail gets ignored or gets overruled in one way or another. One of my favorite pet peeves is the phrase, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. You hear decision makers bring that type of approach up a lot. And unfortunately, the reason it bothers me is that they're giving themselves a free pass, because no one's going to be able to test how good the good thing is, and no one's going to be able to prove to them that what they thought was perfect wasn't really perfect. And the reality is that that kind of a concept really almost gives them license to make whatever decision they think they need to make. So, I mean, in sum, there is definitely a challenge in having these ultimate decision makers, especially in a mega state like California, actually reading the studies, actually paying attention to the details. I'd like to report that they're probably better at that now than they have been in past years, because they really have been hit over the head with just how challenging these problems are and how important climate change is for their decision making.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to stick with you for this next question, but I do want to remind our audience to put your questions into the Q&A part of the Zoom, and we'll get to them in a couple minutes, and that we will be posting this conversation, the administrators will, to YouTube tomorrow, so there will be a link available. I'm seeing a lot of questions about that as well. Steve, we became friends because we talk about utility regulation and PG&E all the time. PG&E being, of course, the biggest utility in California, and one that is responsible for a number of fires over the last half decade. And that's really the result of decades and decades of work that just didn't ever get done to the extent that it needed to. And we know that they are working on it now, but there's just a lot to be done. We're looking at, the prospect of the highest utility rates in the country. Right now, about a 20% rate increase is being put before the commissioners at the CPUC by PG&E, and the other utilities in California are also dealing with a lot of the same issues, just at a smaller scale. I just wonder, and this is a question I think really does have applicability to wherever you are in the country, and that is, are utilities possible? Is it possible to regulate utilities? Having been on the inside of an organization whose whole mandate is to do that, given all the things that are going on with climate and weather, has that mandate just become unachievable?
I think it's possible to do a whole lot better job than we tend to do. And that's been one of the frustrating parts of watching what's been going on the last few years. One of the challenges is that the way that we set rates conventionally for regulated utilities is to look at two things. What kind of ongoing expenses is the company going to have? And how much of a capital investment has the company made in things like power plants or transmission lines or distribution poles and wires or office buildings? And after answering that second question, you decide how much the utility should be allowed to earn in terms of return on that capital investment. And so then you put all these things together, you figure out how much money they need, and then you divvy that up in rates, and that's what people have to pay. The challenge is that the utilities are given an incentive to overinvest in capital facilities and to underspend on operation and maintenance, because those are the two ways they can increase their net earnings, by having a bigger amount of capital investment to earn on, and then taking some of the money the regulators said they could collect in rates and keeping it in their pockets instead of spending it on things they're supposed to spend it on. So you take a company like PG&E, and it has over decades has had the ability to expand that capital investment and to underspend on things like maintaining the lines and doing inspections and replacing equipment. And that's certainly been a factor that's contributed to where we are now. Does that mean that that particular approach to regulation and rate setting can't work? I don't think it does mean that. I think it means, though, that we have to be unashamed about actually looking closely over the shoulder of these utility decision makers as they're running their business. If the utility is starting a new program, there ought to be regulatory staff saying, tell us about this. How are you going to set this up? How are you going to make sure that you're staffing things adequately to meet needs and not create a situation where your employees feel like they need to kind of fudge a little bit on their records and do other things to kind of make it look better than it is, and they're only doing that because there aren't enough coworkers. How are you going to make sure that safety is job one in what you're doing? That kind of constant oversight is something that people have basically disparaged over the years. They say, well, that's micromanagement, and you can't do that. I would argue that with something as important and unavoidable as the transmission grid, the utility electric grid, it's unavoidable. If you want to make sure the system's safe and people are accountable, you have to look carefully over their shoulders. And even in California, where there's been so much trouble with the utilities and wildfires, I think they haven't gone that extra mile yet in terms of acknowledging the need to be very inquisitive, very skeptical regulators, and to be looking carefully over people's shoulders. Yeah. It can be done, though.
Yes, I definitely see that tension, this resistance to getting really hands-on. And the question becomes, well, at what point does it become absolutely imperative? These are life and death issues. And it's life and death in the communities that are affected by these fires, but it's also, as we're learning more and more, Alison, through your reporting and I think the research around air quality, I mean, we have such a long way to go in terms of truly understanding those impacts on our health. And I wonder, one of the things from your story that I think is really important is it's not just laying out the problem. I think you're also trying to address the question of what can be done about it. What did researchers who you spoke with, Alison, for your story about dangerous air, what did they tell you about what can be done to mitigate the impacts?
Right. So, I mean, of course, like climate change has a huge hand in what's going on, but there's also the fact that there's been over a century of fire suppression, which has sort of led to a lot of fuel buildup. And most of the experts, in fact, all the experts that we spoke to, highly recommended that there be more investment on forest management, more action on that, simply because, and there's new research that's come out that shows that exposure to smoke from controlled burns, which is part of what is forest management, is much less toxic and much less harmful to human health compared to exposure to smoke from wildfires, because those are uncontrolled and can be massive. And I guess it requires decisive action at the state and federal level to get that moving and to have more investment to take care of that. But what the data also showed is that in places like Florida, which has been doing it has been doing forest management pretty diligently. And you can see over the decade that smoke exposure in Florida has declined, except for a few counties where now there's a problem of sugarcane burning, sugar crop burning. But the rest of the state has actually recorded an improvement in the number of days that residents are exposed to smoke compared to California, which is now experiencing this huge rise. And I mean, the general sense that we got is that it's a natural way. Controlled burns are a natural way of the forest taking care of themselves. This is a practice that has been going on way before fire suppression came in. It's something that indigenous people would do so often to keep things in check and to keep the ecosystems in check. So that was primarily the biggest finding, the biggest solution that sort of stood out as to what we need to do collectively. So,
the term forest management has become the third rail of California fire politics. Danielle, I'm sure as a scientist, it's something that you probably discuss with your colleagues, but maybe are not quite as comfortable weighing in on in a public forum. But I do want to ask you, what do you think about that debate, if you're comfortable weighing in on it? It has gotten to the point where it's hard to even know where the truth lies.
Yeah, so like Alan said, I have also heard from experts about fire suppression, people who are from experts in that, and how, yes, that is the fuel buildup over the past 100 years or so is really contributing to the sizes of the fires we're having, the severity of the fires that we're having. One thing that as a climate scientist and as other climate scientists, we are still trying to understand kind of what role does climate change have compared to forest management? Is it, if our forests are all managed well through controlled burns, does that mean we don't have to worry about climate change anymore? So that's something that we still don't know. And still something that we are interested in learning. We don't have enough data or sophisticated enough models to study that right now, but we are improving and we are trying to get to that question. So, yeah, I think for me as a climate scientist, that's what I'm interested in, and trying to understand how forest management can interact with climate change and kind of what are the different roles of the two, but that's something we don't know. But yeah, so I'll keep it at that.
Sticking with you, Danielle, before we move on to the Q&A, my last question for you all is, what does your research show about what climate weather is going to look like from here on out?
Yeah, so in terms of fire weather, so having these days with, where fires could easily ignite and spread, both I saw someone asked about the Southeast or the East, the Southeast. We are seeing that going into the future, if we continue to emit greenhouse gases at the rates that we think we're going to emit them based on our current activities, yes, we are going to see these kind of fire weather days increase in the future. And it's really we looked at how aerosols could affect this climate and how greenhouse gases could affect the climate, and really greenhouse gases take over, and through warming the atmosphere and drying some parts of the world, we are seeing these extreme fire days increasing in the future. So that's what we see. Now, how that interacts with the vegetation on the ground, the amount of vegetation we have, ignition rates, that's something we're still trying to understand. But in terms of the weather, that is there, that will increase in the future. That's what the future projections over the next century shows. So kind of put numbers on it. The one study that I had published last year, or I guess earlier this year, showed that in California, that risk of extreme fire weather will be 75% more likely at the end of the 21st century compared to the beginning of the 21st century. In Eastern North America, that's even higher. There's about a doubling of the frequency of those type of fire weather days in the future under the current projections of greenhouse gases and aerosols.
I want to move to the Q&A now. We're getting some really great questions. Keep them coming. But the first two actually have some parallels. And so I'll go ahead and read them. William Lull, an MIT grad from 1978, writes, why isn't California following the forest management practices that Germany follows? They have largely avoided wildfires. And Andrea McGimsey asks, according to the National Climate Assessment, the Southeast actually has more wildfires than anywhere else in the country, which was a big surprise to me. They just aren't as big as out west. With climate change, do we expect for the southeastern fires to get bigger since we live in a giant forest here? Obviously, writing from the southeast. Does anybody want to tackle that question, those two questions, which I think are sort of essentially, you know, to some extent asking, is there a place that has gotten a handle on this, whether it's Germany or the southeastern US? There was an article recently from my old colleague, Lawrence Summer, talking about the fires in the southeast and how they've learned to mitigate them in ways that we in California and the West might learn from. Anybody want to tackle that question? Steve, are you? I'm sorry.
You know, I'm trying to defer to the scientists in the room, but but I guess there are a couple of things. I'm not generally familiar with what happens in Germany, but I think what's pretty well understood in the U.S. is that the U.S. Forest Service has had a standing policy going back to the creation of Smokey Bear to basically stomp out all wildfires, and we know that that's led to overgrowth and a greater potential of having what people refer to as crown fires, because there's so much vegetation closer to the ground that you can get very hot fires that can be windblown and taken up to the top of the trees. And then once you get there, you're in really big trouble. And so we know there's that difference. And we also know that in the West, about half of the land throughout the West is federal land. It's under federal control. So that means that really the vast majority of the forested lands in California have been subject to that policy of stomping out all fires for many decades. And so we're continuing to see phenomenally damaging fires. Most recently, we've been seeing some of the giant redwood trees that we thought could live forever that are being destroyed by fires that are in the Sequoia National Park area and in parts of Yosemite, because there's so much growth around them now that the natural fire resistance of the trees really can't take hold. So is there ability to learn from what other countries are doing? I certainly hope so. But we now are facing a situation where when there's a very significant fire, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of stories to tell about all the places where that fire traveled and what had been done or had not been done to try to properly manage the land that was in that path. If for instance, a utility wire breaks and sparks a fire, it's going to be a very short story if the owners of that land had managed the land in a way that provided sufficient fire breaks. If they'd taken out dry vegetation and kept the distance for trees from buildings, and if they protected those buildings to be able to withstand flying embers, if all these things had been done, then maybe that utility fire is over a few acres later. But if instead it can keep moving from bad management to bad management, sometimes for hundreds of square miles, then you've got a conflagration. And so it's a very sizable problem that we're facing in the West. I would think that a starting point would be for the state to acknowledge that proper management of forested lands is fundamental to quality of life in California, and as you're saying, quality of life across the country as that smoke travels. And create a statewide agency that would set standards for management of forested lands, and then would enforce those standards on local governments up and down the fire-prone areas. we haven't had that level of commitment. Instead, we're trying to put as much money as we can into managing individual parcels of land and not taking that kind of comprehensive approach.
It does also seem, Steve, like there is a philosophical difference in the approach to fire management from a U.S. Forest Service, which is a branch of the USDA, I believe, versus CAL FIRE, so the state agency. Obviously, it's sort of jurisdictional depending on where a fire sparks. You know, if it's on federal land versus state land, that, you know, that philosophical difference is sort of determined by wherever the fire happens to be burning. But, you know, on the one hand, my impression is that the state approach is to be a lot more aggressive about getting in once a fire has started and putting it out. And that there has been this longstanding sort of de facto policy on the federal side to sometimes to just let these fires burn, and that you know, that there has been tension over those differing, you know, those differing approaches.
Yes, and well, again, I think we should throw in another significant land manager here, which is the national parks, which have their own firefighting crews and their own philosophy. So, for instance, we've seen a lot of fires within the boundaries of Yosemite National Park in the last few years, and by and large, they let those fires burn. And this is not the approach, for instance, the CAL FIRE would use if there was a fire that was encroaching on buildings and other structures that are not in these federal lands. And so, yes, we do have this kind of patchwork of ownership and patchwork of philosophies that are being applied. And we haven't yet come to a point where we've recognized the need to have one overall strategy in place. Because after all, if a fire is sparked on state-controlled land, it may very well wind up traveling to federal lands, and vice versa. So we need to have really a common approach for dealing with these things.
Mm-hmm. I have a question from Will Abrams. How do we balance, and he is a Tubbs fire survivor, 2017 in Sonoma County. How do we balance the shorter term political, financial, and social pressures to build back quickly after catastrophic wildfires with the need to build with more resiliency in the face of increasing climate risks? After wildfires, utilities and communities often push to quickly restore power and rebuild structures with mantras like Sonoma Strong or Paradise Strong, and reduce rebuilding standards to make it easier for survivors of fires to rebuild. How do we advocate for increasing building standards, undergrounding lines, home hardening, etc., that are often more costly when utilities, municipalities, and residents are pushing for low-cost rebuild options with fewer regulatory hurdles? Danielle, I'd love your thoughts on this. I know that this is probably a little bit more of more policy than you're used to delving into, perhaps, but because you also focus on the aftermath of fires, you know, we know that building in the wildland urban interface has problems. And so when you see fires go through those communities that are right on the edge of forest land, and then this push to just go ahead and rebuild right in that same place again, Coffee Park just outside of Santa Rosa in Sonoma County comes to mind, where, you know, I was there a year after the Tubbs fire, and a lot of those homes had already been totally rebuilt. What is the consensus view among scientists around, you know, around rebuilding exactly where a fire had just come through? I think there's even a misconception out there that if a fire has come through in one place, that, you know, maybe the vegetation won't grow back in the same way, such that it's still prone to another incident.
Yeah, well, I can talk about kind of the physical or the things on the ground that happen instead of the policy, since that's not my, obviously not my expertise. But one thing we do know about fires, and this is stuff I do study, looking at, I have that kind of the likelihood of having a debris flow after a fire. And we know that for after up to 5 to 10 years after a fire, if you have an extreme kind of rainfall event come through, it's very easy to get a debris flow. So that happened here in Montecito 1 month after a fire in 2018, but it also happened in Colorado recently, and that was 3 years after a fire, or I guess more. I'm trying to remember when the fire was, but it was up to 3 years after a fire, where an extreme rainfall event came through right on top of the fire footprint and caused a debris flow. So there are still really high risks to communities after a fire. We also know that while the vegetation now might not grow back very quickly, or kind of might not grow back the way it used to, up to the way it used to be, there are some things that still grow back that could potentially dry out if there's another drought. There are things that are hardier that do grow back, and if they do dry out after a year, they could again become fuel for a fire. So I think we really need to understand what happens after a fire, any post-fire things that could affect communities if they do decide to rebuild. So I think, I don't know how you would advocate for those, as well as asking. I think maybe from our side, from the scientist side, understanding kind of these post-fire hazards better might help us kind of drive incentives to improving the, instead of building back so quickly, maybe advocating for more smart, more thoughtful ways to move on after a fire. So, yeah.
Could I interject on this? I think Mr. Abrams has really, really hit on the key challenge here. And we see it, of course, not only in California, but, we see a hurricane go through New Orleans. We see, New Orleans strong, and everybody's got to go back and build exactly in the same below sea level places that they built before, and hope that they get a better levee to protect them the next time. I look at it this way. We plan for trying to avoid wildfires. We plan for how to fight them. We plan to how to evacuate people so they can get away from wildfires. We ought to plan for how you respond to the damage of a wildfire. We don't want to pretend that we're giving up on needing to avoid wildfires, but just as we have to start thinking about adapting to a changing climate in many areas, I think we need to be acknowledging, look, we don't want it to ever happen, but let's ask ourselves an important question. If this community were to be destroyed in fire, what would we do to build it back? What would be the criteria that have to apply to moving back into the area? And what would we do with all of the utility infrastructure and everything else that would come along with it? It's a scenario building kind of exercise, but I think if more local governments were to do something like that, there'd be a better ability to manage the response, because of course there's always going to be that enormous pressure to get people back in to their communities as soon as possible and get the tax revenues flowing and have everything return to what seems like normal. We need that kind of planning, I think.
Yeah, I think that this conversation really cannot be confined to the borders of California. And I think that I was actually on a panel on the panelist side of a panel last week, a group of legal journalists that were talking about just, how to do legal journalism. And one of the points that came up was this one reporter did a story about wildfire, basically what are the guidelines that have to be followed when it comes to fire, smoke? Are there any limits in place or anything like that? And she called her sources in the federal government. Folks like me don't have a lot of sources in the federal government. And it turns out there really aren't any standards. And so I feel like, having covered this in California for 3 years, it does feel that this conversation is not getting out into the world beyond our borders at times. And that's really frustrating. We have another question from Melody Bacha, who asks, she says, so given the problem with fires caused by utility lines, should cities and rural areas prioritize their budget to underground these lines as a preliminary step? So to set the table for that, Steve, obviously this is for you, babe. And so the question is, it's really around the idea of like a massive capital investment in undergrounding, which is something PG&E has come up with as an idea, but it almost seemed like a public relations gambit when they announced it, because they were coming off the back of the Dixie fire just a few days later. They say, hey, everybody, we're going to be undergrounding a big fraction of our system for $30 billion, being the high end of the price tag, which is just an unbelievable price tag for something like that. Is undergrounding a viable solution given how expensive it is?
Well, of course, yes. It's the expense that really is the big challenge. What we rely on now is really 19th century technology. And if you look at the first substation that Thomas Edison put in, and then he kind of served electric power to run the lights at a boarding house down the street, you just slapped a couple of poles in the ground, tacked the wires on the poles, and then tacked them on the walls of the building. That was it. And that's what we're doing now. 150 years later, we're doing exactly the same thing. Why? Because it's cheap, or it seems cheap. One of the challenges is that we're not recognizing the costs that could come from those kinds of building approaches, from having the poles and wires above the ground and building transmission lines through forested land. We look at the cost for constructing the line, but we don't think about the liabilities that could come from that, and the fact that someone's going to have to pay off all those liabilities if these lines spark a fire. So undergrounding not only appears very expensive because of that approach of policymaking, but also is very expensive. As you're saying, $30 billion to underground 10,000 miles worth of lines. That sounds like a lot of lines, but it's only a fraction of the lines that run through the state of California. And they're probably only talking about the smaller distribution lines. The bigger transmission lines, which have been sparking some of the more recent fires, wouldn't necessarily be covered by that at all. So in places where there are investor-owned regulated utilities, it's the utility's responsibility, not the local government's responsibility, to make sure that lines are installed safely. And now, starting in the mid-1970s in California, the rule was put in a new subdivision, you got to put the distribution lines underground. So we've got about 40–50% of the state has undergrounded distribution lines. And then for the rest, they're saying, well, we want the utilities to every year be undergrounding some amount of existing above ground lines. And they're given a budget, $20–40 million for trying to underground lines in those particular years. And with a budget like that and timing like that, it will take hundreds of years to get every existing above ground line put underground. So one of the questions here might be, well, should the cities or the counties be stepping in and doing something about this? Well, that was a question that was asked in San Diego a number of years ago. Then they weren't thinking so much about fire safety. They were thinking about visual appeal and wanting to have lines undergrounded everywhere they could in that beautiful city. And so what they did is they went to the utility and said, look, utility, you are collecting a franchise fee on our behalf, and you give us a certain amount of money every year that we can use for accommodating things like you are burying lines in the streets and things like that. We would like to double that franchise fee. We want you to charge more to our customers and collect more money, and let us put that money aside specifically to try to accelerate undergrounding. And so they've been doing that, and they picked up the pace there. And so the city, in that instance, has taken some responsibility to move things along. But it's going to be a very cumbersome process. The first step, though, is for any undergrounding that is being done, we have to stop doing it to make things prettier. We have to start doing it specifically to make things safer. And it's been very, very slow in the utilities parts to turn around and acknowledge that that's the way they have to do things. So it's going to be tough. It is phenomenally expensive. And well, if you spend that $30 billion and do it truly strategically, if you find the highest risk places and you do that, you probably can make a difference. But if you also took that same $30 billion and spent it on putting insulators on all the above ground wires in the state, and putting in more sensors that could help you stop the flow of electricity but more quickly when there is a break in the line, those kinds of things. Maybe if you pencil it out, maybe that's a smarter way to try to reduce risk. And I think it's going to be up to PG&E now coming in to be able to prove that spending that $30 billion to put more lines underground is going to be the most effective expenditure of those funds in order to improve safety overall.
Mm-hmm. We have a comment from Mina Marifat, and she says, thank you for this very important discussion. Some innovative work on landscape and architectural design, such as the work of Kate Orff, ORF, is offering some hope as related to controlling floods. But who is doing innovative work related to fire mitigation? Anybody want to field a question like that? Are there people who, I mean, we are talking about how old the grid is and how undergrounding is this, you know, it's not the end all be all solution, but it seems to be one that we often see trotted out when things get really bad. Are there organizations or individuals, perhaps Dr. Touma, researchers and academics that you're aware of who are doing really innovative work and thinking about how do we bring this conversation into the 21st century?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually not personally familiar with something that innovative. I know that I think Steve's talked about this already, how, you know, CAL FIRE, you know, puts out a PSA every fire season and teaches you how to fireproof your home and that kind of stuff. And I think that can be really helpful. But I'm personally not familiar with anything super innovative 21st century tech.
Well, I am seeing your point is well taken, though. Just this fire season, we've seen, you know, these photos of homes wrapped in, I think it's aluminum or some other kind of metal substance to protect them, and it seems to be working. We've seen this in the Sequoia National Forest, where some of our most treasured trees in California reside. There was a big effort to save some of those, and I had never seen some of those pictures, but same idea, you know, wrap them in aluminum and see if we can make sure that they last through the fire that tore through that particular location. One question for you, Dr. Touma, comes from an anonymous attendee. What type of human activity increases the number of days at high risk for fires?
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of the weather for fires, we see that it's really greenhouse gases, are us emitting greenhouse gases, increasing global temperatures, increasing, changing our weather patterns. That's really what increases the number of days for these high-risk fires. In the past, when we were emitting more aerosols, things like CFCs, more carbon, industrial aerosols, which we've cleaned up quite well as a human population. Unlike greenhouse gases, we did see that in the 20th century, we saw that aerosols had very localized effects, but quite strong effects. They were mostly actually reducing fire weather days in many places. And if we look at Southeast Asia, they were actually increasing fire weather days there. But, you know, since the beginning of the 21st century and moving forward, we really see that greenhouse gases has the most impact on these type of a very outsized impact on these fire weather days, and in almost every fire-prone region across the world, greenhouse gases are increasing the risk of these fire weather days.
Wade asks, mitigation and risk reduction will be extremely expensive and will be one way or another borne by taxpayers or ratepayers. Is it possible to convince people that solving this problem is worth an increase in the taxes or rates paid by people outside of the fire zones?
I could start that if you like. So the here's what happens now. If virtually all the costs for addressing these accelerated fire risks are being borne by the customers of the regulated utilities. The rates can be raised anytime the regulators decide to raise them, and to some extent, everybody is a captive customer of the utility. So things get spent, money gets spent on behalf of these customers to try to help mitigate fire risk all over the state, and it produces some funny results. You've got a company like PG&E that's in Northern California, but its service territory kind of winds its way all the way down to Bakersfield in Southern California. People in Bakersfield are paying in their rates to reduce fire hazards up in Northern California, even though they're not doing anything to cause those fires. North of Bakersfield, you have Visalia, which is located very close to the national parks, and there's a strong interest there in seeing work done in the national parks or that area to reduce fire risk. Are they paying for that? No, they're paying money to Southern California Edison Company, so they're improving fire safety in places like Long Beach, somewhere in Southern California. And so we have this mismatch going on right now, and it's also kind of ignoring the fact that that this is about climate change. It's a broader societal problem. It's not a ratepayer problem. And is that more than an academic difference? It is, especially when we're trying to, among other things, mitigate greenhouse gas emissions by getting people to electrify, getting electric cars, changing out the gas systems in their house for cooking and heating. And if you're trying to get people to do that and you keep piling more and more of these costs onto the utility rates, it becomes harder and harder to get people to electrify. And so we're kind of defeating our purpose by kind of taking these captive customers and slipping all the costs into the utility bills. And this, I think there's a strong argument to be made that this ought to be in the tax structure. Now, the question really went to whether that's going to be politically feasible. Not without a lot of public education, it's not going to be feasible. But it certainly would be, I think, a smarter way to go if we could pull it off.
Yeah, I'd like to add an observation on that, is that when we studied federally funded prescriptions for albuterol, and this is just a cursory sort of analysis of how they had grown over 5 years between 2013 and 2018 in California. And I'm sure there are other variables that have affected it, but we know that wildfire smoke impacts human health. And what we found was that there were 240,000 more prescriptions over 5 years, and that meant about $34 million in taxpayers' money. So, I mean, one way or another, either through risk reduction and mitigation, or if you let it go unignored, there is a cost involved.
I'm curious, Alison, from you, did you take your investigation to people, whether it's federal lawmakers or others, to try to see what kind of reaction they had to your extraordinary findings? I think, frankly, when you report a story like that, the hope is always that it's going to have some kind of impact, that people are going to turn their heads around and say, oh, okay, we should do something about that. And I just wonder what kind of reaction you got if you did that.
Yeah, we definitely did get a reaction, also because we sort of partnered with local stations across the country. So we know that lawmakers in Colorado took notice. We know that California definitely took notice, and that there seems to be some movement even from DC based on what the investigation has sort of shown and sort of spotlighted. So, but I mean, it's still very early. The investigation just came out a few weeks ago. So, and these things take time. So we don't really know. I mean, the hope is that we can create some change, but change takes a lot of time. So. Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a segue into a question from Andrea, who asks, well, she says her father lives in the city of Chico, which is in the northern Central Valley of California. It's a college town. And she says it's close enough to Paradise, the city that burned in the 2018 Camp Fire, to bicycle there. The people of Paradise, she writes, still don't seem to accept the role of climate change on their hometown. And you know, I do talk to fire survivors all over the region in Butte County, as well as in places like Sonoma County. The politics of those two particular counties couldn't be more different. And Danielle, you know, I know you're coming at this from a science background, but I think that there are some, you know, intersections to what you do here, because we still have this segment of America that doesn't think that climate change is real and that climate change is caused by humans. And so when you have these horrible impacts of climate change touch communities where the politics are what they are, I just wonder from you, you know, if you have any response to, you know, that very awkward positioning where the climate impacts are clear, but the politics sometimes prevent people from really making that connection.
Yeah, I think, you know, it's, especially with fires, when there's so many more things involved than just the climate. There's forest management, there's utilities, there's ignition. It's hard to really, you know, with extreme rainfall, for example, it's like, that is the climate, that, you know, the rain falls, that is weather. I think it's easier to talk about things like that, hurricanes, climate, extreme rainfall, storms, tornadoes, when it comes to climate change. But I think with fire, it's really easy to kind of bury the climate change part. And I think it's really hard to dig it back out sometimes, especially because the other concerns are real. It's just that climate change is another big component of it. So I think kind of, you know, I think communicating, having things that, yeah, it's hard to say, but kind of going back to what Alison was saying and Steve was saying about public education, making it clear to people, making it, communicating the science in a way that is understandable, that is digestible to them, I think might make an impact. But I think it's really hard today with all the misinformation that's out there. And I'm not an expert in this, but just a kind of a personal anecdote, a personal opinion about, you know, how easy it is for people to kind of read not the wrong thing, but a different opinion about something, and to really kind of cling onto that. And yeah, I guess I don't have a solution to that, but I think just educating is really the way to go. And
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you're doing the work when it comes to that. William Lull asks a question that Steve, maybe a good one for you. The question is, are you sure that electrification is a valid goal? That's a big one to wrap your arms around. But, you know, when we think of, you know, the origins of just PG&E's system, obviously there are many systems that follow this model. But, you know, once upon a time, it was an absolute miracle that we were electrifying communities in Butte County or Calaveras County, far from the mothership in San Francisco, where PG&E has long been headquartered. It's moving to Oakland, but you know, really, this was an amazing thing for those communities. Are we seeing a shift in the conversation right now away from electrification towards microgrids or other options that might be safer?
Well, it is kind of ironic if we have big fires that are sparked by electric systems, and we're saying we got to get more people to be more dependent on electricity. But what I think is clear is that we have to stop using fossil fuels in a way that can release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Period. Stop. We have to do it. And so some people say, well, fine, to some extent we can use carbon capture and sequestration. We could maybe continue to have natural gas fire plants, but capture all the greenhouse gases and store those underground in a vault forever, right? And maybe we can do that to some extent, but it's going to add cost. It's going to add more pollution because of the mechanics of actually separating out the greenhouse gases. It's going to use more water. So it's going to be, I think, of limited utility. What we have to do is we have to decarbonize the grid. We have to make sure that we're relying on renewables and storage and managing demand in a way that can allow us to have a clean grid. But many of the end uses for fossil fuels, like natural gas in homes and businesses, it just has to stop. Because if we continue to, you have to remember that it's not just a matter of burning these fossil fuels and dealing with the carbon dioxide. It's also a matter of the fact that there are billions of burner tips in the United States on people's stovetops, for their hot water systems, in commercial and industrial settings. And in virtually each one of those, there's some level of inefficiency. So you turn on the gas, and it may be a split second, but there's going to be no gas burning for a split second till the flint ignites it. And so why is that important? Because when you're not burning the gas, but releasing it, you're releasing methane into the atmosphere. And methane is a far more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So we just have to stop using fossil fuels in buildings. And one of the key alternatives to that would be to, in fact, use electricity in the buildings instead. We now have very efficient heat pump systems that, at least in many parts of the country, can efficiently create heating and cooling, both of air and then also heating of water. And we can rely on those systems. We just have to make sure that we build a grid that's going to be green in and of itself. Same thing with vehicles. There's a big push now for trying to rely on what people refer to as green hydrogen. Green hydrogen means, well, we're going to separate hydrogen out from water and then use that hydrogen as a fuel. And it's especially green if you use renewable energy to separate out the hydrogen. And so there's a big vision there. It would require a tremendous amount of infrastructure to be improved, and to phase it in would take decades. And during that time, we'll continue to rely on burning fossil fuels, and we just can't afford to do that.
We haven't talked about equity in the context of, the politics of power and, renewable, the conversation around renewables. And we're sort of short on time, Steve, but I'd really welcome it if you could just briefly touch on the direction of that dialogue right now. We are seeing this revolution of people, you drive around Berkeley or Oakland, you'll see, these rooftop panels everywhere you go. But where are we looking when we think about 10 years from now, 15 years from now? What is that doing to equity within the, customer base of a utility, of any given utility in California that's investor owned?
Yeah, there have been programs to try to encourage people to put solar on the rooftops now for 15 or 20 years. And it's been a very important tool to help bring down the overall cost of solar, because you've got economies of scale now that have effectively brought the cost of solar down from over $10 per installed watt to under $1 per installed watt. And that is phenomenally important. Great success. But in the meantime, we've done two things. We've mostly put the solar on rooftops for people who've got a fair amount of money. And we've also taken some of the customers out of the rate system because they're making their own solar on their rooftops, which means you're taking the fixed cost of the system, all that infrastructure, and you're piling it into smaller level of sales. And so the customers who are left, which may be more low-income customers than the population would otherwise describe if everybody was in the system, they're paying more for their electric service. And so there is a huge equity problem there. is it a solvable equity problem? That's really a matter of philosophical debate. What the state has done is recognize that problem, created specific programs designed to get solar on the roofs of low-income homes and apartments. Part of the challenge, of course, is lower-income people don't own as many roofs as people with a higher level of income. And also in terms of rentals, you have people living in rental buildings where there's not enough space on the roof to provide solar enough for everybody in the building. We've looked at things like community solar. We have a separate facility that's actually benefiting some of the people who live in that community who can't have it on their own rooftop. There's a lot of money and thought that's gone into these programs. The question that I can't answer for you is this producing more than a token movement in the direction of greater equity?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that when we look at utility policy writ large over the last 20 years, there are a lot of things that sounded like a good idea, but have not panned out nearly as well as boosters may have hoped. So always important to think, many steps ahead as we think about policy making. I do want to thank everybody who took the time to join us this evening. Thanks to all the folks who put these incredibly thoughtful questions into the Q&A. Dr. Touma, Steve Weissman, and Alison Saldanha, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for taking the time. And for people in the audience who may want to watch this down the road, it's going to be posted tomorrow to YouTube. So make sure to check it out, and hopefully you'll get to share it with some of your colleagues all over the country.
Thank you, Lily.
Thank you.
Thank you.